when narcissists realize you're not the weak, stupid person they thought. And I want to sit with that phrase for a moment before we go anywhere else, because weak and stupid are not words that most narcissists would use explicitly, not out loud, not in the language they deploy when they want to maintain the performance of being a reasonable person who simply has higher standards than most. But underneath the language they do use, the subtle corrections, the gentle implications that you are overreacting or misreading, or simply not quite equipped to understand the full complexity of the situation. Underneath all of that polish, deniable condescension is an operational assumption that functions exactly like those two words. The narcissist chose you, in part, because something about you read as manageable, as someone whose perception could be shaped, whose reality could be influenced, whose responses could be anticipated, and therefore worked within the way that a skilled manipulator works with predictable material, not necessarily because you present it as overtly weak or obviously naive. In many cases, the opposite is true, and the narcissist was attracted specifically to your apparent strength, because the conquest of strength produces more significant supply than the conquest of something that was already yielding. But because something in the initial dynamic suggested that you were, in the specific way the narcissist needed you to be, workable. And workable, in the narcissist's operational vocabulary, is the closest word they have to what they actually mean, which is manageable, which is underneath the more palatable framing, something very close to those two words that the title does not shy away from. And the moment they realize they were wrong, the moment the assumption of manageability meets the reality of who you actually are, and what you are actually capable of seeing, and the specific quality of clarity through everything the relationship required you to survive. That moment is the subject of this entire episode, and it is one of the most psychologically significant moments available in the entire arc of a narcissistic relationship. So stay with me, because what happens in that moment, and what the narcissist does with what they discover in it, and what it means for every subsequent dynamic between you, is something that most people who have lived through it have never had explained to them with the specificity it deserves. Let's start with what the narcissist's original assessment of you was based on, because understanding the assessment is what makes its collapse so specific and so consequential. The narcissist's initial read of any potential relationship target is not a single evaluation made at a single moment. It is a continuous, largely unconscious process of pattern recognition that runs throughout the early stages of any significant interaction, gathering data about what this specific person is going to respond to, what they are going to be moved by, what their particular vulnerabilities are, and how those vulnerabilities can be most efficiently engaged. This process is not calculated in the way that implies a person sitting somewhere consciously running assessments. It is more instinctive than that, more automatic, built from years of practice at reading people for the specific information a narcissist needs. Not the information that genuine connection requires, not the deep, reciprocal understanding of another person's interior life, but the operational information. What moves this person? What threatens them? What they need enough to overlook things they would otherwise not overlook. What history have they brought to this interaction that can be engaged with, sympathized with in the love-bombing phase, and eventually used as material? The narcissist who chose you ran this process on you, gathered this data, and arrived at an assessment that felt confident enough to proceed. And somewhere in that assessment was the operational assumption that you were, in the specific ways that matter to how a narcissist navigates a relationship, predictable enough to manage. What they missed is what they always miss about the people who eventually produce this specific moment of realization. The part of you that was not on the surface. Not because you were concealing it strategically, not because you presented a false front designed to deceive, but because the part of them that reads people for operational data does not have sensors calibrated for the specific frequencies that matter most. The narcissist's perceptive system is extraordinarily well developed for reading vulnerability, for identifying what someone needs and fears and values in ways that can be engaged with strategically. It is correspondingly underdeveloped for reading depth that is not a vulnerability, for the specific quality of perception that a deeply aware person carries without announcing it, for the kind of clarity that develops not through naivety being replaced by cynicism, but through genuine experience being processed with genuine honesty, for the patience that is not passivity, but is the particular steadiness of someone who has learned that understanding something fully before acting on it is more powerful than reacting quickly. All of this was present in you from the beginning, and none of it was visible to the narcissist's assessment process, because the assessment process was not looking for it. It was looking for what it needed to find in order to proceed with confidence. and so it found what it was looking for. The genuine vulnerabilities that were also present, the real needs that the love bombing would engage with such apparent precision, the authentic history that would be met with such convincing empathy in the early stages. And it built its operational map of you from those findings, and it missed everything else. It missed the depth underneath the vulnerability, the clarity developing beneath the confusion of the early dynamic, the specific quality of attention you were bringing to the relationship that was, from the very beginning, registering far more than the narcissist's behavior was designed to produce. This is the foundational irony of the moment of realization. The narcissist's assessment was not entirely wrong. The vulnerabilities they identified were real. The needs they engaged with were genuine. The history they appeared to understand was accurately perceived, at least in its surface dimensions. The assessment failed not because it was reading the wrong person, but because it was reading only part of the right person. The part that was available to the specific kind of reading the narcissist system performs, while the more significant part, the part that determines who wins and who loses, and who walks away with what in the long arc of this dynamic, remained invisible to an assessment that was never calibrated to detect it. And the moment of realization is the moment those two parts of you become simultaneously visible to the narcissist. The part they assessed and the part they missed. The part they thought they were managing and the part that has been, this whole time, watching the management with a clarity and a specificity that the management was never designed to withstand being observed with. The narcissist looks at you and sees for the first time that there are two of you where they thought there was one. The one they mapped, and the one behind the map, who has been there the entire time, and who knows things about the dynamic and about the narcissist themselves that the narcissist had no idea were being known. Now here is what actually triggers the realization, because it does not usually arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It arrives through accumulation, through a series of moments in which the expected response does not appear, in which the manipulation lands differently than it was supposed to land, in which something in your behavior or your composure or the specific quality of your reaction to something that should have produced a predictable response produces instead something the narcissist map did not predict and cannot immediately account for. The first few times this happens, the narcissist system generates an explanation that preserves the map. You are having an off day. The approach needs adjustment. The tool needs recalibration rather than replacement. The map is not wrong, the map is simply being applied incorrectly. So the approach is adjusted. The tool is recalibrated. And the adjusted approach meets the same quality of response that the original approach met. And the recalibrated tool lands in the same way that the original tool landed. And the map is consulted again, and the map still has no adequate explanation for the consistency of the gap between what was predicted and what is being received. And it is in the repeated consulting of a map that keeps failing to explain the territory that the realization begins to form. Not as a conscious thought, not as an explicit acknowledgement that the assessment was wrong, because explicit acknowledgement of being wrong is not something the narcissist's psychology handles gracefully, as a shift in the quality of their attention toward you. A slight recalibration of how carefully they are watching you. A new quality of alertness in their interactions with you that was not there before. Not the easy confidence of someone who knows their terrain, but something more careful, more monitoring, more specifically focused on gathering information that the original assessment failed to gather. The narcissist has started to sense that there is something in you that the map did not capture. And sensing it without being able to identify it clearly is the beginning of the specific discomfort that this episode is about. And what that discomfort produces in their behavior toward you, and the specific ways it changes every dynamic between you, and what the fully realized version of this moment looks like, and what it means for what comes next. That is exactly where we are going. What the discomfort produces in the narcissist's behavior is something that most people on the receiving end of it have experienced without having an adequate framework for understanding what they were watching. Because the behavioral shift that follows the beginning of the realization does not look like what you would expect it to look like. If someone who had been managing you suddenly discovered that the management was not as complete as they believed, you would expect perhaps a retreat, a pulling back, a recalibration conducted from a safe distance while the new information is processed. Or you would expect an escalation of the existing tools, a doubling down on what has always worked before in the hope that increased intensity will produce the response that normal intensity has recently failed to produce. Both of these things do happen at different stages of the realization's development. But the first and most distinctive behavioral shift that the beginning of the realization produces is something more specific and more psychologically revealing than either of those. The narcissist becomes, in certain very specific interactions, almost imperceptibly more careful with you. Not kinder necessarily, not warmer, not the return of the love bombing that characterized the early stages of the relationship. More careful in the specific sense of someone who is suddenly aware that what they are saying is being heard more completely than they intended it to be heard. Someone who has sensed, without being able to fully articulate the sensing, that the person in front of them is receiving not just the content of what is being communicated, but the architecture of it. The structure underneath the words, the intention behind the framing, the gap between what is being said and what is actually meant, and the awareness that this level of reception is happening produces a quality of self-consciousness in the narcissist that is genuinely foreign to a psychology whose primary operational mode is the confident deployment of tools that have always worked. The tools are still being deployed, but they are being deployed by someone who is now, for the first time, not entirely confident in the deployment. This self-consciousness is significant beyond what it appears to be on the surface, because self-consciousness in the narcissist is not simply an emotional state. It is a structural disruption. The narcissist's tools work because they are deployed from a position of complete confidence in their effectiveness. The confidence is not separate from the tool. It is part of the tool, and it produces in the person on the receiving end the specific quality of certainty that makes the manipulation convincing. When you are not sure something is happening to you, when the situation is ambiguous enough that your own perception feels uncertain, part of what is generating that uncertainty is the complete conviction of the person doing the thing. Remove the conviction and the tool loses a significant portion of its force. The manipulation that arrives with a quality of self-consciousness behind it is not the same manipulation that arrived with complete confidence. It has a slightly different texture, a slightly different quality of energy behind the delivery, a slightly increased hesitation that the empath or the awakening person on the receiving end registers before they can consciously name it. The gaslighting that arrives from a narcissist who is no longer entirely confident that the gaslighting will work lands differently than the gaslighting that arrived from a narcissist who had no doubt about its effectiveness. And you, who have been developing the specific kind of clarity that produced the realization in the first place, register the difference. You feel the hesitation. You notice the self-consciousness. And the noticing of it confirms something you have been sensing for a while, but could not quite crystallize into knowing, that the dynamic has shifted. That something in the balance of information between you has changed. That you know more about what is happening than you are supposed to know, and that the narcissist has begun to sense that you know it. Now here is where it becomes important to understand the specific ways the narcissist responds to the full crystallization of the realization. The moment when the sensing becomes knowing, when the map's failure becomes undeniable, when they look at you and understand with sufficient clarity that the person they thought they were dealing with is not the person they are actually dealing with. Because this moment does not produce a single response. It produces a sequence, and the sequence has a logic that understanding helps you navigate without being destabilized by any individual stage. The first response in the sequence is testing, a rapid, often subtle series of interactions designed to confirm or disconfirm what the narcissist has begun to suspect about the extent of your clarity. They will say something that requires a specific response from someone who is still operating within the reality they constructed for you. Something that only makes sense as a neutral statement if you are still accepting their version of events, their framing of the relationship, their account of who is responsible for what and why things are the way they are. They are watching to see if you respond to the statement from within their constructed reality or from somewhere outside it. And when you respond from outside it, when the response you give is the response of someone who is seeing clearly rather than someone whose perception they have successfully shaped, the confirmation arrives. You are not who they thought you were. The realization is complete, and the sequence moves to its second stage. The second stage is the one that most people find most destabilizing, because it is the most counterintuitive of the sequence, and the one that most resembles the early stages of the relationship in ways that make it genuinely difficult to navigate without the specific understanding of what is actually happening. The second stage is a sudden, significant increase in charm and attention and apparent investment in the relationship. Not the full love bombing of the idealization phase, but something that has the same quality. A sudden warmth, an apparent genuine interest, conversations that feel more real than most of what the relationship has contained in recent memory, moments of vulnerability that seem more authentic than the performed vulnerability that the narcissist usually deploys. This increase in positive engagement is not what it appears to be, and is not what most people instinctively hope it is. Evidence that the relationship can be what it sometimes felt like it could be. Evidence that the person who was there in the early stages is still available. Evidence that what felt real was real, and is still accessible if the right conditions are created. What it actually is a strategic recalibration. The narcissist who has confirmed that you are seeing more clearly than the original assessment accounted for is now attempting to restore the conditions under which the seeing was less clear, to reintroduce enough warmth and enough apparent realness and enough of the specific quality of connection that the early stages produced to soften the clarity that has been developing, not to genuinely reconnect, to blur, to reintroduce the ambiguity that clarity has been replacing, to make the territory uncertain enough again that the map has a chance of working. And it works with a frequency that would be more discouraging if it were not also completely understandable, because the warmth is engaging something that is genuinely present in you. The hope that is not stupidity, but is simply the natural response of a person who loves something real in the early stages and has not fully stopped loving it. The narcissist knows this hope is there. The realization told them it was there, and the second stage is directed precisely at it. The third stage arrives when the second stage does not produce the desired result. When the recalibration fails to restore the ambiguity, because your clarity has developed beyond the point where warmth alone can bore it. And the third stage is the one that is most directly relevant to understanding what the realization actually costs the narcissist, what it reveals about the limits of the construction, and what it means for the long-term trajectory of any dynamic between you. The third stage is anger, not the controlled, deniable anger of the earlier relationship, the pointed comment and the subtle punishment and the withdrawal of warmth that was calibrated precisely enough to maintain the appearance of reasonableness. This anger is less controlled. It has a quality of genuine frustration that is different from the performed frustration the narcissist typically deploys, because what is being frustrated here is not a preference or a standard or an expectation of how you should behave. What is being frustrated is the fundamental operational assumption that has governed the entire relationship, the assumption of manageability, and the frustration of a fundamental operational assumption in a psychology organized around the maintenance of control does not produce the calibrated, purposeful anger that serves a function. It produces something closer to genuine dysregulation. Anger that is not entirely in service of a strategy but is the direct expression of a system encountering something it was not designed to handle. And in that anger, less controlled than anything you have seen from them before, less purposeful, less oriented toward a specific outcome, and more simply the expression of a system under genuine stress. You see something that you have not seen clearly before. You see the construction under pressure. You see the mechanism without its usual smooth operation. You see the gap between the performance and the person behind it more clearly than the performance, at its most polished, ever allowed. And what you see in that gap, if you are paying the kind of attention you have been developing throughout everything this relationship required you to develop it through, is not frightening. It is clarifying. Because the anger that arrives when the narcissist realizes you are not who they thought you were is not the anger of someone powerful encountering a worthy adversary. It is the anger of someone whose sense of control has been built on an inaccurate map, and who is now experiencing the consequences of the inaccuracy in a context where they cannot simply redraw the map and proceed as before. It is the anger of someone who has discovered, too late to prevent the discovery from being consequential, that the person they were managing was never manageable, was always seeing, was always developing the clarity that this moment is now the product of. And in the anger of that discovery, for the person who can see it clearly is not a threat, it is a confirmation that everything you suspected about what was happening in the relationship was accurate, that the clarity you developed was real and is worth trusting, that the map the narcissist drew of you was always wrong in the most important dimension, and that the person standing in front of their anger now, unmanageable and clear-eyed and no longer organized around the assumption that the map was accurate, that person is not who the narcissist thought they chose. And the narcissist, in the full heat of the realization, is beginning to understand what that means. Not fully, not with the self-awareness that would make the understanding productive, but enough to know that what they had planned to do with this relationship and with you is no longer available to them in the form they planned it.